It was noon on Monday, October 21, 2002, when Herschel Shanks, editor of Biblical Archaeology Review, announced at a press conference in Washington, D.C., that a limestone ossuary or bone box inscribed in ancient Aramaic with the phrase, "James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus," had surfaced in Jerusalem. The next morning, front-page stories about the James ossuary were in practically every newspaper in the world. Even though the ossuary had once held the bones of James, not Jesus, most of the stories emphasized that the inscription was the only physical artifact ever found from the first century that mentioned Jesus. The writers had to scramble a bit to deal with the James side of the story, since it quickly became obvious that few people were even aware that Jesus had a brother named James. We were told that a private collector, later revealed to be an Israeli named Oded Golan, had bought the ossuary 15 years earlier from a Jerusalem antiquities dealer who said it came from the area of Silwan, just south of the old city of Jerusalem. Golan had not paid much attention to the inscription nor realized its significance. In April 2002, he'd shown a photo of the ossuary to André Lemaire, professor of Semitic languages at the Sorbonne, who was on a visit to Jerusalem. Lemaire was immediately intrigued, recognizing that the combination of names and relationships very likely pointed not just to any James, but to the James, who was the brother of Jesus in Christian tradition. Shortly after, Golan allowed Lemaire to study the actual ossuary. After careful examination, Lemaire was convinced that the inscription was authentic. Later in interviews, Golan was asked why he had not recognized the potential importance of such an artifact when he first bought it. He explained that as a Jew he was of course familiar with the Christian teaching of Mary's virginity, but had never imagined that Jesus, the Son of God, could have had a brother. Obviously, he was not alone in that assumption. Lemaire told Herschel Shanks about the ossuary when Shanks was on a visit to Jerusalem in May 2002. Shanks was duly cautious, and arrangements were made for experts at the Geological Survey of Israel in Jerusalem to examine it. Inscriptions on ossuaries can of course be forged, but modern cuts into ancient limestone will not contain the ancient patina that naturally coats the surface of the stone over time. Shanks brought in several expert paleographers to give their opinions on the authenticity of the script itself. The ossuary passed all the authenticity tests with flying colors. There seemed little doubt that the ossuary once held the bones of a James, son of a Joseph, with a brother named Jesus. Also, this James had died and been buried in the 1st century A.D. Shanks knew that next to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, this was perhaps the most sensational archaeological find in modern times. With Golan's permission, Shanks arranged a special exhibit for the ossuary at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto for late November 2002. Toronto was slated to be the host city for the annual meeting of thousands of biblical scholars, archaeologists, and academics in the study of religion the weekend before Thanksgiving. The Israeli Antiquities Authority had to approve the temporary export license, but at that point the Israelis did not recognize the potentially explosive attention that the ossuary would generate. When the ossuary suddenly made world headlines, the Israeli authorities were taken completely unawares. They immediately initiated an investigation into the circumstances of Golan's acquisition of the ossuary, but they did allow it to leave the country. The arrangements for the Toronto exhibit were already in place. However, according to Israeli law, if Golan had acquired the ossuary after 1978, it would have been sold illegally and subject to confiscation by the state. When the ossuary arrived in Toronto, it had been cracked in transit, and the scientific team at the Royal Ontario Museum took on the task of repairing it for the exhibit. One of the cracks ran through part of the inscription, allowing them to more closely examine the way the letters were cut into the limestone. They agreed that ancient patina was present in the letters. It was firmly adhering to the stone and consistent with the rest of the ossuary. Yet even before the Toronto exhibit, questions were being raised about the conclusions of Lemaire and Shanks. No one questioned the authenticity of the ossuary itself. It was clearly a genuine artifact from the time of Jesus. But some argued that the phrase brother of Jesus appeared to be written in a different hand than James, son of Joseph, and it might have been added by a forger. Still others maintain that even if genuine, we would never be able to prove that the James, son of Joseph, of the ossuary, was the brother of Jesus of Nazareth, since all three names were common. I first viewed the ossuary at the November meeting in Toronto. I think most of us were convinced that we were standing before the actual 2,000-year-old stone box that had once held the bones of James, the brother of Jesus of Nazareth. When the James ossuary was returned to Israel in February 2003, the Israel Antiquities Authority confiscated it and appointed a team of 15 experts to make a judgment as to the authenticity of all or part of the inscription. In June 2003, the committee declared the ossuary genuine, but the inscription a partial forgery. Golan had been formally indicted and charged with adding the phrase brother of Jesus to an otherwise genuine ossuary, attempting to coat the letters with a fake baked-on patina, and lying about when he acquired the ossuary. The indictment gave the public the impression that the experts had now concluded that the James ossuary was a forgery. Such was hardly the case. André Lemaire, the Sorbonne epigrapher, continues to strongly defend the authenticity of the inscription. The Israel Antiquities Authority geologists have had to back down on their initially proposed theories as to how the allegedly fake patina was produced. The James ossuary inscription is likely authentic. There is also reliable circumstantial evidence that it was looted from our tomb of the Shroud. Was it possible that we had unknowingly stumbled upon the Jesus family tomb? The main inconsistency in Oded Golan's story has to do with when he acquired the ossuary. In October 2001, he said that he had had it for about 15 years. He later said he acquired it in the mid-70s, or about 25 years earlier, when it was legal to buy such items. At one point, he said he acquired it in 1967, but the rest of his story is consistent. He says that he bought it from an Arab antiquities dealer in the old city of Jerusalem, who in turn said it came from the area of Silwan, an Arab village south of the old city where the Kidron and Hinnom valleys meet. Oded Golan expanded upon the Silwan location in December 2002, explaining that in fact the James ossuary came from the Hinnom Valley. Of course, Akeldama in Hinnom is the precise location of our Tomb of the Shroud. According to Shimon Gibson, only 2 tombs were looted in the Hinnom Valley area in the 1990s. The first was not excavated and was resealed. There is no evidence that ossuaries were taken from that one. The second was our Tomb of the Shroud. There is one ossuary in particular from our Tomb of the Shroud that caught our attention. It has a simple incised border running around the edges of the side panels. It is precisely the style found on the James ossuary. Gibson and I recently visited the warehouse in Beit Shemesh, where we looked through the vast rows of shelves holding the enormous ossuary collection of the State of Israel. We saw no other examples matching these two. It seemed to us another piece of the puzzle. It makes sense that a single family might buy 2 ossuaries from the same artisan, and thus the styles would be matched. There's one way this matter might be settled. The James ossuary had significant bone material still in it when it was first shown to Herschel Shanks. Oded Golan later cleaned out these fragments before shipping the ossuary to Toronto. Since we have already done extensive DNA tests on the skeletal remains of the inhabitants of our Tomb of the Shroud, why not test the bones from the James ossuary to see if there's any possible match of mitochondrial DNA? That would tell us whether the deceased of the James ossuary had any sibling relations in the tomb, or perhaps that one of the females was his mother. It would be particularly interesting to look at the DNA sequence of the James ossuary remains and are Maria or Mary from the tomb of the Shroud. On November 17, 2003, Gibson and I made a formal request to the Israel Antiquities Authority that we be allowed to carry out such DNA tests on these skeletal fragments from the James ossuary. Our request was promptly denied on the grounds that the bones in the ossuary had been added by Golan to camouflage the forgery. Our hope is that when the trial of Golan is completed and some of the emotions died down, we will still be able to pursue these scientific tests. But there's another intriguing side to this unfinished story. The James ossuary was not the first to generate worldwide headlines about ancient ossuaries and their possible relation to Jesus. Shortly before Easter in 1996, another dramatic story broke: Jesus' family tomb discovered. It was reported that a tomb discovered back in 1980, but never brought to public attention, contained a significant cluster of names associated with the Jesus family, including a Mary, a Joseph, a second Mary, a Jude, son of Jesus, a Matthew, and most significantly, a Jesus, son of Joseph. The London Sunday Times paraded the story in a full front-page feature article under the title, "The Tomb That Dare Not Speak Its Name." As with the James ossuary, the Israelis were caught in the middle of things. When had the tomb been discovered? Why had it not immediately been reported to the public? Was there some type of cover-up due to the shocking contents of the tomb? In 1995, the year before the story broke, a BBC film crew led by Ray Bruce and Chris Mann was in Jerusalem filming a documentary on the resurrection for their upcoming Easter special. Their aim was to bring to the British public the latest and best historical and archaeological evidence related to the reports of Jesus' empty tomb and his resurrection. They arrived at the archaeological warehouse of the Israel Antiquities Authority in a rundown suburb of Jerusalem, where they had arranged for some routine filming of a few first-century ossuaries. Ray and Chris had done a bit of homework. They had learned that of the 1,000 or more ossuaries stored and cataloged in various Israeli collections, 6 bore the name Jesus, and of those 6, 2 were inscribed with the designation Jesus, son of Joseph. The first, found in 1926, is beautifully carved and clearly legible. The second, found in 1980, is nearly illegible. As luck would have it, both were housed in the warehouse. The crew was understandably pleased to be able to film an intact ossuary with such an inscription from the very period of Jesus' lifetime. But then the excitement began. Chris and Ray asked whether any of the other ossuaries in the collection were related to either of the Jesus, son of Joseph ossuaries. It turned out 5 others were shelved nearby that had all been found in the same tomb as the second Jesus, son of Joseph ossuary. The tomb was in East Talpiot, just south of Jerusalem's Old City. The tomb had been uncovered when TNT was detonated by a construction crew putting up a new apartment complex. Out of curiosity, Ray and Chris asked about the names on the other 5 ossuaries. Chris later commented that as the names were ticked off, it felt like the balls of the national lottery coming up and approaching the jackpot. In addition to the Jesus, son of Joseph ossuary, there was a Joseph, a Mary, presumably his wife, another Mary, a Jude, son of Jesus, and a Matthew. For the crew, this was a journalistic moment made in heaven. The traditional tomb where Jesus was buried after his crucifixion is just outside the Old City to the north, the site today of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Jesus had been placed hastily in a tomb near the crucifixion site by an aristocratic and influential sympathizer, Joseph of Arimathea, and not in his own family tomb. Even the Gospels imply that he was only temporarily put there due to the rush of the Passover holiday. Although the family was from Nazareth, a town to the north in Galilee, the New Testament indicates that Mary, as well as Jesus' brothers and sisters, had taken up residence in Jerusalem. Tradition has it that Mary, mother of Jesus, did in fact die and was buried in Jerusalem, not Galilee, and there are no fewer than 2 sites shown today to tourists that lay claim to being the spot. Needless to say, this Talpiot tomb had not been put on any tourist map. Was it possible that Jesus' mortal remains were finally buried with those of his father and mother? Might the other Mary be either a sister or his close companion, Mary Magdalene? Could the Jude, son of Jesus, be his biological son? The possibilities were as intriguing as they were shocking and heretical. The BBC producers interviewed various Jewish and Christian archaeologists and historians familiar with the tomb. Everyone seemed to agree that although the names were interesting, the name Mary was the most common female name in the period, and the name Joseph the second most common male name after Simon. A spokesperson for the Israel Antiquities Authority said, "The chances of these being the actual burials of the Holy Family are almost nil." But it was the almost that interested the producers. The only way anything else could be done scientifically would be to carry out mitochondrial DNA tests on the bone samples to ascertain how the individuals buried there might be maternally related. If neither of the Marys turned out to be the mother to this Jesus, it would at least eliminate the possibility that this was the mother and son of Christian faith. But one of the Marys could also be a sister. Since Joseph was such a common male name, we should not assume that the ossuary with the name Joseph refers to the father of the one called Jesus, son of Joseph. He could easily be related in another way, or not at all. For example, Jesus of Nazareth also had a brother named Joseph. Biblical scholar Father Jerome Murphy O'Connor of Jerusalem's École Biblique commented that although there was no way to prove the ossuary inscribed Jesus, son of Joseph, had contained the bones of Christ, if such proof could be made, the consequences for the faith would be disastrous. The Israelis are very sensitive to the Christian world, and they are pleased to fill the role of the welcoming custodians for Christian tourism of the Holy Land. The last thing in which they would want to be involved is some archaeological find that would spark controversy or provoke Christian theological debates. A Jesus family tomb would be problem enough, but one that contained an ossuary marked Jesus, son of Joseph, would surely place them in the most delicate situation imaginable. Perhaps there was more to learn from a careful re-examination of all the evidence related to the tomb, or maybe even from a further investigation of the site itself. The media had reported, however, that an apartment building had been built over the site of the tomb shortly after its excavation in 1980, obliterating the site and foreclosing any possibility of further direct investigation. Ray Bruce and his crew had been told that the ossuaries were empty of bones, indicating that the tomb had likely been robbed in an earlier time and the bones lost or scattered. We now know that this was not the case. According to the official report on the Talpiot tomb published in 1996, these ossuaries definitely held bones. By Israeli law, all human remains from the tomb have to be turned over to Orthodox Jewish authorities for reburial, apparently precluding the possibility of DNA or any other kinds of scientific tests. I say apparently because most ossuaries, even those in the Israeli State Archive collection, still contain slight residues of human remains and fragments of bone material. Unless the ossuaries are scrubbed clean, which is not the normal practice, modern sophisticated DNA tests can yield evidence from the tiniest sample.